Hi, my name is Nathan. I've been talking about differential tool use for foraging in chimpanzees. So tool usage is a very unique behavior that is seen in less than 1% of all species. It involves using objects such as rocks and plants in the environment to manipulate surroundings and is primarily used for foraging purposes. This requires having an advanced understanding of what materials work best for certain tasks, and chimpanzees show evidence of this. Many studies have been done examining the impacts of the environment on tool use tactics, including the studies that I'm going to be highlighting here. The effect of the environment and resource availability on tool use was experimentally examined by testing these three predictions. Starting with prediction 1, we're going to be looking at structural and mechanical properties of materials are a selection criteria for tool use within the chimpanzees. So researchers basically quantified the stiffness, or as they called rigidity, of the probes used by chimpanzees to fish for termites in a mound. Basically, the probe needs to be rigid enough to kind of follow the shape of the termite hole, but not too flexible or loose, or otherwise it won't really work well. It won't really follow the shape of the termite hole too well. I kind of just touched on this, but the higher rigidity means that the material is more resistant to bending. So for example, metal is more rigid than wood, is a quick way to think about that. So they first looked at, it's a bit small, but it's graph A. They were looking at the known common plant tool sources species for chimpanzee tool use for termite fishing, and they compared the rigidity levels of these known sources to the less common plant source species. And it was found, it's hard to see, but the more common resources are the green on the left of the top left graph, and they're slightly less rigid than those that aren't common tool plant source tool use species, which is the red graph to the right of that. The second thing they looked at, they compared rigidity and number of plant sources found in the area. That is the top right graph. The left is the most preferred plant source for tool use. The middle is less preferred, and the right is least preferred. As you can see, there's a common positive linear sort of correlation seen there, which just basically means, kind of on the same point as the previous graph, that they prefer slightly less rigid instruments when comparing the plant source species in the area. The bottom left graph they were looking at rigidity of tool source species available at the mound and whether they were used or not. There were far more that weren't used than used, and the majority of those that weren't used were higher rigidity than the ones that were used. And the final graph, they just compared the rigidity of the plant sources that any of the chimpanzees had tried to use to fish. On the left is the most prevalent tool source used, and that was a stick. Going to the right was a vine with far less, bark with far less than that, and grass, which was only used a handful of times. And basically it was found that raw material types significantly influenced rigidity and subsequent chimpanzee tool material choice. Moving on to prediction 2. This involves two hypotheses. The first one being the opportunity hypothesis, which is that encounter rates with nuts, insects, and tools explain the tool use pattern. So whichever sources they come by more often are going to be the more prevalent ones used or eaten, depending on if you're looking at the source or the food. Encounter rates with the resources that require tool use and tool materials drive patterns of tool-assisted foraging. This hypothesis predicts that lack of exposure to nuts or tools explains the absence of nut cracking behavior. It also predicts that high encounter rates with army ants, but limited opportunities to encounter termite mounds leads to patterns showcasing tool use. Researchers analyzed the spatial distribution of chimpanzee ranging within a 26-kilometer area, and they compared this to the availability and distribution of nuts, termites, army ants, and potential food sources. It was just based off of chimpanzee observations, as we said, and it compared the encounter rates with the different food and tool sources. And then moving on, the second of the two hypotheses tested in this was the necessity hypothesis, which is that tool use is a response to scarcity of preferred foods. The preferred foods that they assumed it was ripe fruit. So they said if there's a lack of fruit, then that's when the chimpanzees will engage in tool use, because it doesn't necessarily take a tool for them to get the ripe fruit. This graph on the bottom middle left with the black line in the columns, the columns are kind of just the availability of nuts, which isn't too important here. We're more focused on the black line, which is the food availability index, or fruit availability index, the most preferred, as the researchers thought, food type. And so in instances where that line dips a bit further is where the researchers were testing to see if this is when there would be a heightened use of tools, and comparing that to the table to the right, that is the frequency of the chimpanzees foraging on termite mounds. On the left are values from the early wet season, which is about March, and the right is late wet season, which is October. So it doesn't quite line up, but March is one of the higher months of fruit availability, the most preferred food, and the late wet season being in October, it lines up with one of the lower ripe fruit availabilities. So they thought, oh, there should be a stark difference between the two if there's a necessity, if the necessity hypothesis is to be correct. But the chimpanzees forage on termites quite frequently during months where there's a lot of fruit and months where there's it's very scarce. So the necessity hypothesis essentially was deemed incorrect, and the opportunity hypothesis was more accepted between the two. Moving on to prediction 3, they looked at the compactness of soil or presence of a physical barrier, as one of the tests was just an open hole. Affects frequency of tool use in excavation. They essentially put fruit at the bottom of an artificial hole in an enclosure, and it was either open, as I said previously, covered loosely in soil, covered in very compact soil, or covered in compact clay. And the researchers observed chimpanzees and their excavation tactics employed under different hole conditions. As previously stated, it was hypothesized that the compactness of the material covering the hole would affect the frequency in which chimpanzees used tools for excavation. it was predicted that chimpanzees would use tools more frequently to excavate the compact soil. And what do those bars mean? Well, okay. The green was when the chimpanzees perforated. The orange is when they would dig. The light blue, which is difficult to see because it didn't happen too often, was enlarging of the hole on the sides. Yellow was when they would pound the hole. Probe, sticking a stick inside the hole, was dark blue. And dark orange, which again wasn't very prevalent, not really seen on this, was when they would shovel, make a shoveling motion. Okay. And looking at the results of these experiments, there is strong support for prediction 1, that the structural and mechanical properties of materials are a selection criterion for tool use. There was a strong correlation between rigidity and whether or not chimpanzees chose to use the material to fish for the termites. Chimpanzees were shown to select certain resources, majority of the time twigs, with rigidities that weren't too stiff and that weren't too flexible so that they could conform to the shape of the termite hole. There was moderate support for prediction 2, specifically 1/2 of prediction 2's 2 hypotheses that were looked at. As stated previously, the opportunity hypothesis was the one that was supported, as nut trees and termite mounds were rare and the chimpanzees' range and army ants were more abundant and foraged for more as a result. However, there wasn't support found for the necessity hypothesis, as when preferred fruits were scarce, no other food source functioned as a fallback tool. So tools were not used because what the researchers deemed was the preferred food was scarce. They would use tools whether the preferred food was abundant or scarce. And there was actually no support for the prediction made for prediction 3. There was no significant effect between differing soil compactness levels and tool use frequency. The first 2 predictions out of these 3 strongly support the hypothesis that there is differential tool use in chimpanzees based on environmental factors and foraging. This is because chimpanzees are shown to have an advanced understanding of what types of resources are useful for foraging, and the rate in which they encounter known food sources affects the foraging tactics they choose to implement. Thank you for watching, and those are my sources. And yeah.